late 2023, a panel of international medical experts led by Dr. Shu Lee, a prominent Canadian neonatologist, conducted a detailed review of the air embolism evidence. Their findings were damning. The panel concluded that the skin discolorations cited as evidence of air embolism were not, in fact, reliable indicators of injected air. The medical literature simply didn't support that conclusion. The skin patterns could be caused by many different conditions, some benign, some serious, but not necessarily indicative of deliberate air injection. Moreover, the panel noted that definitive diagnosis of air embolism requires specific tests, imaging studies, or post-mortem examinations looking for air bubbles in blood vessels or organs. In the Letby cases, such tests had either not been performed or had not revealed clear evidence of air. Dr. Lee's panel wasn't alone in raising concerns. Dr. Michael Hall, a British neonatologist, published his own analysis questioning the air embolism diagnosis. He pointed out that the prosecution's lead expert, Dr. Dewey Evans, was a retired general pediatrician, not a specialist in neonatal medicine. Hall argued that Evans had misunderstood or misapplied neonatal physiology in his conclusions. Other experts joined the chorus. Some pointed out that one of the key papers cited at trial, a case study from the 1980s, actually described a very different clinical scenario and didn't support the prosecution's theory at all. The medical community was beginning to seriously question whether the air embolism evidence was scientifically sound. Then there was the insulin evidence. Remember, two babies, baby F and baby L, had experienced episodes of severe low blood sugar with abnormally high insulin levels. The prosecution argued this proved exogenous insulin poisoning. But critics raised several concerns. First, the blood samples have been stored for extended periods before testing, sometimes years. Some experts questioned whether degradation or contamination could have affected the results. Second, the specific test used to measure C-peptide, a substance that helps distinguish between natural insulin and injected insulin, had limitations. Some endocrinologists argued the results were ambiguous and didn't definitively prove poisoning. Dr. Alan Wayne Jones, a prominent toxicologist, published an analysis arguing that the insulin evidence was not scientifically justified. He contended that without additional confirmatory testing and without ruling out other potential causes of the abnormal results, the conclusion of deliberate poisoning was premature. Other toxicologists and endocrinologists weighed in with similar concerns. The prosecution had presented the insulin cases as among the strongest evidence against Lucy Letby. But now, experts were saying that evidence might be deeply flawed. By mid-2024, the critiques had reached a crescendo. Major media outlets, including The New Yorker, The Economist, the British Medical Journal, and British newspapers like The Guardian and The Times, published lengthy investigations into the case. Science journalists interviewed multiple independent experts who expressed serious doubts about the medical evidence. Some went so far as to call it junk science. A group of statisticians also weighed in, arguing that the shift pattern analysis, while seemingly damning, could be misleading. They pointed out that once you start looking for patterns in complex data, you can find correlations that seem significant but are actually due to chance or confirmation bias. The controversy reached such a level that it prompted official responses. The Royal Statistical Society issued a statement warning about the dangers of misusing statistical evidence in criminal trials. While they didn't comment specifically on the Letby case, the timing and context were clear. The Nursing and Midwifery Council, the regulatory body for nurses in the UK, came under pressure to examine whether the evidence in the case met appropriate standards. And most significantly, Lucy Letby's legal team compiled all of this new expert material and submitted it to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent body that investigates potential miscarriages of justice. The CCRC has the power to refer cases back to the Court of Appeal if they believe there is a real possibility that a conviction is unsafe. By late 2024 and into 2025, the CCRC was actively reviewing the Letby case, considering the new expert evidence and determining whether it warranted sending the case back to court. But here's where things get complicated and controversial. In July 2024, before much of the expert criticism had reached its peak, Lucy Letby's legal team had already made an application to the Court of Appeal. They argued that the trial had been unfair for several reasons: prejudicial pretrial publicity, problems with the judge's directions to the jury, and concerns about the reliability of expert evidence. The Court of Appeal, in a written judgment issued on July 2, 2024, rejected most of these arguments. The judges made a crucial point. Much of the expert evidence that Letby's team wanted to rely on wasn't actually new. The defense could have called their own experts at trial to challenge the prosecution's medical theories, but they had chosen not to. Under English law, appellate courts are generally reluctant to allow defendants to present evidence on appeal that could and should have been presented at trial. The thinking is that defendants shouldn't get a second bite at the apple. They need to mount their full defense the first time around. The Court of Appeal concluded that while there were debates among experts about the medical evidence, those debates existed at the time of trial. The defense had the opportunity to call contrary experts, but didn't do so effectively. Therefore, the verdicts should stand. This reasoning has proven controversial. Critics argue that the defense team at trial may not have fully appreciated just how weak the prosecution's medical evidence was. Some of the most detailed critiques only emerged after extensive post-trial review by multiple independent experts. Moreover, they point out the prosecution's expert witnesses presented their theories with great confidence at trial. The jury had no way of knowing that large parts of the medical community would later disagree with those conclusions. Should a defendant be convicted based on expert evidence that the scientific community later determines to be unreliable? And if so, what does that mean for the integrity of the criminal justice system? These are not abstract questions. They go to the heart of how we use scientific and medical evidence in criminal trials. In the United States, there's a legal standard called the Daubert Standard, which requires judges to act as gatekeepers, carefully scrutinizing scientific evidence before allowing it to be presented to a jury. The evidence must be based on sound methodology and accepted within the relevant scientific community. In England and Wales, the standard is somewhat different. Expert evidence is generally admissible as long as the expert is qualified and the evidence is relevant. The weight given to that evidence is up to the jury to decide. But what happens when a jury, made up of ordinary citizens with no medical or scientific training, is asked to evaluate highly complex, contested scientific evidence? How can they possibly judge whether an expert's opinion about air embolism or insulin poisoning is scientifically sound? The answer, traditionally, has been that the adversarial system takes care of this. The defense calls their own experts to challenge the prosecution's experts, and the jury weighs the competing testimony. But critics of the Letby case argue this system broke down. They say the defense didn't adequately challenge the medical evidence, leaving the jury with a one-sided view of the science. And there's another uncomfortable question. Did the horrific nature of the alleged crimes, the murder of helpless babies, make it psychologically difficult for the defense, the jury, and even the judges to properly scrutinize the evidence? When faced with such emotionally charged allegations, is there a natural human tendency to think someone must be responsible for these deaths? Someone must be punished. Some commentators have drawn parallels to other controversial cases where medical evidence later proved unreliable. Cases like that of Sally Clark in the UK, who was wrongly convicted of murdering her 2 infant sons based on flawed statistical evidence, or the numerous shaken baby syndrome cases in the US that have been overturned as the science has evolved. It's important to note that not everyone agrees with the critics. Many people, including some medical experts, legal professionals, and members of the victims' families, firmly believe Lucy Letby is guilty. They point out that the case wasn't based solely on medical evidence. The shift patterns, the eyewitness testimony from Dr. Jairam in the Baby K case, the handwritten notes, and Letby's behavior all contributed to the convictions. 2 separate juries heard the evidence and both convicted her. These were ordinary people who carefully considered the case for months before reaching their verdicts. The Court of Appeal reviewed the case and found no basis for overturning the convictions. Supporters of the convictions also note that some of the experts now criticizing the case didn't actually review the full trial evidence. They based their opinions on media reports and summaries rather than the thousands of pages of medical records and testimony that the jury heard. And they point out that in any complex case, you can always find experts who disagree. The existence of disagreement doesn't mean the original evidence was wrong. So where does the truth lie? As of early 2025, the case remains under review by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Their investigation is ongoing, and it could take years before they make a decision about whether to refer the case back to the Court of Appeal. In the meantime, Lucy Letby sits in prison, serving a whole life sentence. She continues to maintain her innocence. The families of the babies, some of whom believe justice was served, others of whom may be developing doubts, struggle with uncertainty and grief. And the medical and legal communities continue to debate what this case means for the future of expert evidence in criminal trials. But there's another part of this story that's often overlooked. What happened at the Countess of Chester Hospital before Lucy Letby was arrested. Remember, senior consultants raised concerns about the cluster of deaths as early as 2016. But according to multiple reports, hospital management was slow to act. Why? Some of the consultants who raised the alarm have spoken publicly about their frustrations. They say they repeatedly warned hospital executives that something was wrong, that babies were dying unexpectedly, and that Lucy Letby might be responsible. But they claim their concerns were dismissed or downplayed. Hospital management allegedly prioritized avoiding scandal and protecting the institution's reputation over investigating potential criminal activity. In fact, according to some reports, when consultants continued to press their concerns, they were told to stop making allegations and even threatened with disciplinary action. Hospital administrators later said they had conducted reviews and consulted experts, but found no definitive evidence of wrongdoing at the time. They said they were in a difficult position. They couldn't simply remove a nurse from duty based on suspicions without concrete proof. But critics argue the hospital should have involved police much sooner and should have taken stronger action to protect patients while the concerns were being investigated. The question of whether hospital leadership was negligent or even criminally culpable in their handling of the situation led to a separate police investigation. In 2024, as part of an ongoing probe into corporate responsibility, police began investigating whether hospital executives should face charges of gross negligence manslaughter. The theory was that by failing to act on the consultant's warnings, hospital leaders may have allowed preventable deaths to occur. In early 2025, police arrested 3 former senior managers from the Countess of Chester Hospital on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. They were questioned and released on bail pending further investigation. This investigation is separate from Lucy Letby's convictions and doesn't affect her criminal case. But it's a crucial part of the broader story. If hospital management did fail to act appropriately on warnings, then the tragedy at Chester wasn't just about one individual nurse. It was also about systemic failures in governance, accountability, and patient safety. There's also a statutory public inquiry underway. The Thirlwall Inquiry, named after its chair, Lady Justice Thirlwall. This inquiry is examining the events at the hospital, the response by management and regulators, and what lessons can be learned to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The inquiry is hearing from families, medical staff, hospital executives, and regulators. It's expected to issue recommendations about neonatal care, hospital governance, and how concerns about medical professionals should be handled. The inquiry has already revealed troubling details about the culture of the hospital during the relevant period, issues with staffing, communication breakdowns, and a reluctance to escalate concerns. Whether these systemic problems contributed to the deaths and collapses remains an open question, but they clearly created an environment where warning signs may have been missed or ignored. The Lucy Letby case forces us to confront some deeply uncomfortable questions about our criminal justice system, about medicine, and about human nature itself. First, there's the question of medical evidence in criminal trials. How do we ensure that juries aren't misled by expert testimony that sounds authoritative but may not actually be supported by solid science? How do we balance the need to hold criminals accountable with the risk of convicting innocent people based on unreliable evidence? The history of criminal justice is littered with cases where what seemed like rock-solid scientific evidence later turned out to be wrong. Fingerprint analysis was once considered infallible, until cases emerged where prints were misidentified. Bite mark analysis was used to convict numerous people until studies showed it was unreliable. Even DNA evidence, while generally robust, can be misinterpreted or contaminated. In the field of pediatric medicine specifically, there have been several high-profile cases where medical evidence of abuse or murder was later discredited. The Sally Clark case in the UK is the most famous example. She was convicted of murdering her two sons based on an expert statistical testimony that was later shown to be fundamentally flawed. Clark was eventually exonerated but died a few years after her release, her life destroyed. Could Lucy Letby be another Sally Clark? Or is she genuinely guilty, and the current controversy just noise from contrarian experts? The truth is we may never know with absolute certainty. That's the uncomfortable reality of many criminal cases, especially those based on circumstantial and medical evidence. The legal system requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, not absolute certainty. But where exactly is that line? Second, there's the question of how we investigate suspected crimes in medical settings. Healthcare institutions have a duty to protect patients, but they also have responsibilities to their staff. How do you balance the need to investigate concerns about a medical professional with that person's right to due process and protection from false accusations? The consultants at Chester believed they were raising legitimate safety concerns, but from the hospital's perspective, they were making serious allegations without definitive proof. How should such situations be handled? There are legitimate concerns about creating a culture where medical professionals are too afraid to work with high-risk patients because they fear being blamed if those patients have bad outcomes. Neonatal intensive care involves extremely vulnerable patients. Even with perfect care, some babies will die or suffer complications. If we create an environment where every unexpected death leads to suspicion and investigation of the staff involved, might that actually harm patient care by making doctors and nurses overly defensive? On the other hand, we know that healthcare serial killers do exist. They're rare, but they're real. Nurses and doctors like Harold Shipman, Beverly Alitt, and Janine Jones did deliberately harm patients. Hospitals and healthcare systems need to be able to identify and stop such individuals. Finding the right balance is extraordinarily difficult. Third, there's the question of motive, or the lack thereof. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Lucy Letby case is that there's no clear explanation for why she would have done these things. Most murders have understandable motives: anger, jealousy, financial gain, self-defense. Even serial killers often have identifiable psychological patterns: sexual gratification, feelings of power, delusional beliefs. But what could possibly motivate a neonatal nurse to harm babies? The prosecution suggested she enjoyed attention or liked playing the hero during resuscitations. But is that really a sufficient explanation for multiple murders? Some people argue that the absence of a clear motive is actually evidence that Lucy Letby might be innocent. If we can't understand why someone would commit a crime, maybe they didn't commit it. But others point out that human psychology is complex and often inexplicable. People do terrible things for reasons that seem trivial or incomprehensible to others. The absence of an obvious motive doesn't mean a crime didn't occur. Moreover, in English law, the prosecution doesn't have to prove motive, only that the defendant committed the criminal act with the required intent. Motive can be helpful evidence, but it's not legally necessary. Still, the lack of a satisfying explanation for why Lucy Letby would have done these things continues to trouble many people who have followed the case. Finally, there's the question of what we owe to the victims and their families. These families have suffered unimaginable losses. They entrusted their babies to medical professionals, and those babies died. Some families spent years believing their children died of natural causes, only to later be told their babies were murdered. They deserve answers. They deserve justice. They deserve to know the truth about what happened. But what if the truth is uncertain? What if we can never be entirely sure whether these deaths were murders or tragic medical events? For some families, Lucy Letby's convictions brought a sense of closure. Finally, someone was being held accountable. For others, the ongoing controversy about the evidence has created new uncertainty and pain. There's no easy answer. In a case like this, someone is going to suffer regardless of the outcome. Either a guilty person goes free, or an innocent person is imprisoned for life. Either families believe their babies were murdered and the killer walks, or they believe their babies died naturally, but someone was wrongly convicted. So where does the Lucy Letby case stand today, in 2025? The legal facts are these. Lucy Letby was convicted by 2 separate juries of 7 murders and 8 attempted murders. She is serving a whole life sentence in prison. The Court of Appeal has reviewed her case and declined to overturn the convictions. But the scientific and medical debate continues. Independent experts have raised serious questions about key pieces of evidence. The Criminal Cases Review Commission is investigating whether the case warrants a fresh appeal. A separate investigation into hospital management is ongoing, with 3 former executives arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. A public inquiry is examining what went wrong at the Countess of Chester Hospital and what systemic changes might prevent similar tragedies in the future. And throughout all of this, Lucy Letby maintains her innocence. What should we make of all this? If you believe the prosecution's case, Lucy Letby is one of the most prolific serial killers in modern British history, a trusted medical professional who betrayed her duty in the most horrific way imaginable, murdering helpless babies for reasons we may never fully understand. If you believe the critics, Lucy Letby may be an innocent woman wrongly convicted based on flawed medical evidence, statistical misunderstanding, and a natural human desire to find someone to blame for a tragic cluster of deaths. The truth, whatever it is, lies somewhere in the evidence, the medical records, the expert testimony, and the countless details that 2 juries spent months examining. What we can say with certainty is this. Between 2015 and 2016, babies died and suffered collapses at the Countess of Chester Hospital under circumstances that remain disputed and troubling. Families lost their children and have lived with grief, uncertainty, and the horror of not knowing exactly what happened. A nurse's life and career have been destroyed, either because she committed terrible crimes or because she was wrongly accused. The British medical and legal systems have been forced to confront difficult questions about expert evidence, statistical reasoning, and how we investigate suspected crimes in healthcare settings. And we, as a society, have been reminded of something important. The pursuit of justice is messy, complicated, and sometimes frustratingly uncertain. We want definitive answers. We want to believe that the legal system gets it right, that guilty people are convicted and innocent people go free. We want to believe that science and medicine provide clear, objective truths. But the reality is more complex. Evidence can be ambiguous. Experts can disagree. Well-meaning people can reach different conclusions from the same facts. The Lucy Letby case will likely be debated for years, perhaps decades. It may become a landmark case in the history of expert evidence in criminal trials. It may lead to reforms in how we handle suspected healthcare crimes. Or it may eventually be overturned, joining the list of famous miscarriages of justice. We don't yet know how this story ends. What we do know is that at the heart of this case are babies who died, baby A, baby C, baby D, and all the others. They were real children who deserve to live. They deserve the best possible medical care. And their families deserve the truth, whatever that truth may be. This has been the story of the Lucy Letby case, one of the most complex, controversial, and heartbreaking criminal cases in modern British history. In creating this documentary, we've tried to present the facts as they're known, the evidence as it was presented, and the controversies as they've emerged. We've tried to be fair to all sides, to the prosecution's case, to the defense's arguments, to the independent experts raising concerns, and above all, to the victims and their families. If there's one lesson from this case, it's this. The pursuit of truth requires humility. It requires us to question our assumptions, to carefully examine evidence, and to remain open to the possibility that we might be wrong. Whether Lucy Letby is guilty or innocent, whether justice was served or a terrible mistake was made, these questions remind us that our legal system, for all its strengths, is operated by fallible human beings trying their best to navigate impossibly difficult questions. The search for truth continues. The investigation continues. And the babies at the center of this tragedy deserve nothing less than our most careful, thoughtful, and honest efforts to understand what happened to them. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe to see more.